This is Professor Cruz. Welcome to week 5 of World Cultural Geography. Our topic this week is migration. Migration captures the interests of geographers because it is fundamentally geographic. The act of migrating affects both the place of origin and the migrant's destination. Geographers are interested in how and why people migrate. As we begin to explore migration, think about how migrants from within the United States and migrants from other countries have an impact on the cultural landscape of the Washington metropolitan area, or the DMV, as young people call it in the vernacular. As we consider migration this week, we will answer specific questions such as: who is likely to migrate to another region in their country? Who is likely to migrate to another country? Why do people migrate? What are some of the largest migration streams to the United States in its history? Migration is defined as a permanent change in residence to outside of one's community of origin. So let's think about this definition. You have to move, it has to be permanent, and it has to move from one area in a country to another, or from one country to another. So when I moved 1 mile from a condo to a house in the same county, I did not change my job, my doctor, or my friends. That does not count as a migration. That counts as a move. Officially, migration is defined as crossing an administrative boundary, such as a state, a county, or a nation. And remember, the move must be permanent. So when students such as yourself move to attend college, or someone moves to take a temporary position, like a migrant worker, these moves do not count as migration, because as a student, you probably will move back to your parents' home. The move is not considered to be permanent. Cyclical movement also occurs every day as residents of the DMV move toward the node of the Washington metropolitan functional region to work. Because they return home each evening, this is a cyclical movement and does not count as migration. So remember that definition of functional region. Washington, D.C., downtown would be considered the functional region, with downtown being the node. People move from other parts outside, as far as Baltimore, as far as West Virginia, as far as Fredericksburg, to commute. But these are not permanent moves. This is cyclical movement. Periodical movement is when you move to go to college in another state. So we will start locally and consider internal migration, which occurs when a person moves from one place to another within a country. And this is not within the same local area. So consider somebody like myself who moved from New Mexico to Maryland. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, just 4% of the population migrated internally between 2014 and 2015. While about 12% of the population moved, such as from within a county to the same county, most movers stayed within the same county. In fact, just 2% of the population migrated to a different state. So we tend not to move very far. As your text discusses, interregional migration has slowed since the recession, but the Northeast and the Midwest are still losing residents, as is shown in this map, this choropleth map, which shows the areas that are losing population in blue and green, and the areas that are gaining population in orange and red. So this gives you a chance to work on your state knowledge. And you can see that the states that are receiving the highest number of internal migrants are Washington State, Texas, Florida, and North Carolina, while those states in the Midwest are losing populations, as well as 2 states in the West, California and Nevada, which are also losing population. People are trending toward moving to the Sun Belt or the Pacific Northwest. Now, this is a very creative map that shows the proportion of people living in the state where they were born. So again, the proportion of people living in the state that they were born. In the United States, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan have the highest percentages of people living in the state who were also born in that state. Also, Louisiana. So, Louisiana has the highest with 79% of the people who are living in the state were born there. Michigan is second with 77%. Ohio and Pennsylvania are third and fourth. Those numbers are represented in the circle. So this is kind of a proportional symbol map, but not completely, which shows the percent who were born, the circle, which is light gray, that were living in the state who were also born in the state. The other colors, the green, orange, blue, and red, are showing which other regions in the United States folks lived in or were born in. The dark gray shows the portion who were born outside of the United States who live in the state. So to talk about our local area, 48% of Marylanders were born in Maryland, but only 37% of DC residents were born in DC. California has the highest portion of residents born in other countries at 28%. Now, the states with the fewest natives born in the state are Nevada, where 25% of people who were born in Nevada live in Nevada, and Florida with 36%. So that would make the District of Columbia third with, again, 37%. And in the district, 16% were born in other nations. If you want to take a look at this map, it was from the New York Times. You can do a search for mapping migration in the United States in the New York Times. Now we're going to move on to discuss international migration. Remember our discussion about the core and global periphery from week 2. Global core countries, also known on the World Population Data Sheet as more developed countries, include Northern America, most of Europe, excluding most of the former communist countries, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. The peripheral areas are the least developed. They are exploited by the core through their cheap labor, raw materials, and agricultural production. Remember from our discussion of population that countries in the global core are typically in the fourth stage of the demographic transition. This stage is characterized by low or even negative natural increase. Countries in the periphery are typically in the second or third phases of the demographic transition. The second stage is characterized by the most rapid growth and is the phase where most international migration is likely to occur. Remember that also that core countries have created physical and legal barriers to limit immigration from the periphery. With globalization, the opportunities for international migration or immigration seem greater. We hear stories in the news about undocumented immigrants, refugees, and other international migration. Much desired immigration from the periphery or semi-periphery to the global core, but core countries establish barriers to limit immigration, particularly undocumented immigration. Each year, just 5 to 10 million people migrate from one country to another. Some of the more active international migration streams are from the developing world are from Latin America and Asia to Northern America, and from the Middle East and North Africa to Europe. The number of international migrations more than doubled between 1980 and 2010, from 103 to 220 million. In 2013, the number of international migrants was 232 million, and this is projected to double to over 400 million by 2050. International migrants are defined as persons outside of their country of birth for at least a year. Each migration corridor has unique features, but there are 4 major migration flows. Now, in this case, on this graph, the authors use south and north definitions as opposed to periphery or core or more developed and less developed. So the South equals the periphery or semi-periphery, which also equals less developed nations. The North equals the global core or more developed nations. So the South is a developing country and the North is an industrialized country. The largest flow of immigrants is from South to South. Just over 82 million in 2013 moved from South to South, and this represents 36% of international migrants. They move from one developing country to another, such as from Indonesia to Saudi Arabia or from Nicaragua to Costa Rica. South to north is the second largest flow, just under 82 million, or 35%, move from a developing to an industrialized country, such as from Morocco to Spain, from Mexico to the United States, or the Philippines to South Korea. North to north is 54 million people, or 23% of international migrants move from one industrialized country to another, such as from Canada to the United States. And north to south, where about 14 million people, or 6%, move from industrialized nations to less developed countries. We will consider the types of migration using immigration to the United States as an example. Remember when we studied population that the components of natural increase are births and deaths, but to calculate population change in a nation such as the United States, you must also consider immigration. You can look at your data sheet to see that a third of the growth in the United States is from immigration. Think about the world population video that you viewed a few weeks ago. When humans were hunters and gatherers, they may have migrated in search of food. Some geographers call this type of migration primitive migration. Environmental change, natural disasters such as drought, or plagues such as attacks on locusts can lead humans to move in search of food. This type of migration was typical of Native Americans before the arrival of Europeans. So people moved from Asia across the Bering Strait, which was land at that time, and to North America and down into the other Americas like Latin America. Also consider immigration to the New World, which occurred as European nations experienced growing population when they reached stage 2 of the demographic transition. During stage 2, countries experienced high birth rates and declining death rates, and the population grew rapidly. And this led to mass migration from countries such as England. This is before 1950. Most of the immigration to the United States was considered mass migration. As the name implies, mass migration involves a large group of people moving together. This can be a community, an entire tribe or ethnic group, or even an army that resettles in an area that it has invaded. The British settlement and colonization of North America beginning in the 1600s is an example of mass migration. This type of migration is also considered to be voluntary or free, as migrants' decisions to relocate permanently were made without coercion of the government in power. The United States has more foreign-born residents than any other country, approximately 43 million as of 2010, and growing by 1 million annually. There were three main eras of immigration in the United States. Colonial settlement of the 17th and 18th centuries. There was immigration from Europe and sub-Saharan Africa. Most of the Africa migrants were forced to migrate as slaves. The second era was mass European immigration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In the beginning of the second era, most migrants came from Northern and Western Europe. By the turn of the 20th century, most migrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe. And the third major period of immigration is more recently from 1960 to the present. Asian and American immigration dominated the late 20th and early 21st centuries and still continues to dominate the migration streams to the United States. So there was a huge shift in the sending continents. Early it started from Africa and Europe, continued in Europe, changing the sub-regions in Europe, and now it is Asia and Latin America. The third type of migration is forced. In the 16th through the 19th centuries, millions of Africans were brought to plantations in the United States and other countries in the Americas to work as laborers. This map shows what is called the Atlantic slave trade. At least 12.5 million Africans were sold as slaves to work for mostly white landowners in the Americas. The arrows show the regions from which slaves were transported and where they were transported to. The width of the arrow indicates the number of slaves that were sent to various regions. So the wider the arrow, the more immigrants were sent. From an estimated 1.5, while an estimated 1.8 million died during the journey, the majority were sent to work on sugarcane fields in Brazil and the Caribbean. Only about 4% came to the United States to work in cotton and tobacco fields. Most of the slaves came from West Africa, about 75%. The others mostly came from what is now the Congo, Angola, and Mozambique. Another example of forced migration is the Trail of Tears, or the forced migration of Native Americans from Georgia to Oklahoma in 1838 and 1839. So as we move forward, we'll consider how all of these migration streams have impacted the cultural landscape of the United States. And this is something I want you to think about as we move on to additional chapters in your text. So why do people migrate? Let's examine push and pull factors. People who migrate voluntarily decide to migrate because of a combination of two factors. Pull factors induce people to move out of their present location, and push factors induce people to move to a new location. So there are three major types of push and pull factors. Political, and this could be war, like the Syrian refugees are an example of political migrants. A refugee has been forced to move to avoid a political threat to his or her life, and he or she cannot return for fear of persecution. Other examples of refugees include Cuban immigrants in 1959, 1980, and 1994, and Asian refugees who came from Vietnam after the war in 1975. Environmental factors such as flood and drought are also push factors. Hurricane Katrina is a perfect example. So Hurricane Katrina forced people to move from the area because of the hurricane, and then they had to choose which areas that they were pulled to. And most people chose from economic reasons. Some used the concept of chain migration. They moved to areas where their relatives lived. So people who move to a warmer climate, such as elderly people who move after they retire, the warmer climate is the pull factor. Most people move for economic reasons. They are seeking work or a better job. When my family moved internally in the United States from Seattle to Albuquerque, and then from Albuquerque to the DMV, it was because my father received promotions to move to new locations. Can you think of instances where your family has moved? What were their push and pull factors? Let's also look at Ravenstein's laws of migration as to why people move. In the 1980s, a British geographer named Ernst George Ravenstein studied migration within Great Britain and developed a series of laws that he felt governed migration. For long-distance moves, he determined that most long-distance migrants were male, they were adult individuals, not families, and they were young adults seeking work. Of the migration to the United States during the 19th and most of the 20th centuries, most migrants were males. Now most migrants are females, and this reversed in the 1990s, and women now constitute about 50% of the immigrants to the United States. Some of this is likely due to the changing role of women in Mexico. So more of our migrants are from Mexico. Also, Mexico is a shorter migration stream than immigration from earlier time periods. Also, about 40% of immigrants to the United States are young adults between the ages of 25 and 39. Ravenstein also demonstrated that most migrants move short distances. So again, as I discussed, they are moving from say, one state in the United States to another state, but in fact, my family moved from Kansas to Nebraska in the 1920s, but they actually only moved one county. So they moved across the state line from one county in Kansas to the next county over, which happened to be in Nebraska. Long distance migrants also move to major cities. Urban dwellers are less likely to migrate than rural dwellers because rural dwellers are seeking better employment. They're moving from farms to the city. And women migrate more than men, but they do not go as far. And within an area, people who have more education are more likely to migrate than people with less education, but the people have less education than the folks in the place that they are moving to. So when people move, they have an impact on the cultural landscape. We learned in this week that international migration is likely for countries in stage 2 of the demographic transition. Consider the international migration to our region and decide if you think that's true. And how has immigration shaped the local and national culture of the United States and our region? Think about the nature of who moves, how that has affected our cultural landscape. And as we move forward to next week, think about the folk and popular culture and how they are represented in your life. And generally, as we continue in this course, continue to explore your local neighborhood and observe the cultural landscape in your community. I look forward to seeing you in person this week. Have a great week.